The chamber was silent, but not the calm kind of silence. It was the silence that follows a lightning strike, when the air itself still trembles. Cameras clicked, pens froze, and every eye turned toward the woman who had just broken through the wall of politeness with words sharp enough to cut steel. "You don't get to lecture us on dignity," the Congresswoman declared, her voice ringing through the vaulted room. Her tone wasn't just anger, it was history speaking, frustration boiling over generations. Each syllable carried the weight of women dismissed, immigrants overlooked, working families forgotten. Across from her sat Melania Trump, polished and poised, draped in the kind of designer precision that had always been her armor. She straightened slightly, forcing her expression into stillness, though the flicker in her eyes betrayed something else. Surprise, maybe even fear. This wasn't a photo shoot. This wasn't a carefully choreographed appearance beside her husband. This was raw America, unfiltered, staring her down. The Congresswoman leaned forward, gripping the microphone as though the entire country sat across from her. "You've lived in golden towers. I've lived in neighborhoods where children skip meals so their parents can pay rent. Don't tell me we don't know hardship. Don't tell me we should be grateful for crumbs." A murmur rippled through the room, half shock, half approval. Reporters glanced at each other, already knowing the headlines were writing themselves. This was no ordinary exchange. It was a collision, privilege meeting fury, polish clashing with fire. Melania inhaled slowly, the practiced breath of someone used to maintaining composure. She placed her hands neatly before her, the faintest smile curling on her lips, as if to say she would not be rattled. But the room knew. Everyone knew. Something had shifted, and the carefully maintained mask of the former First Lady was cracking. The Congresswoman's voice dropped lower now, more deliberate, more dangerous. "You can stage your speeches, you can dress your image, but here, in this house, truth has no filter." The silence returned, thicker this time, charged like a storm waiting to break. And the question lingered in the air, unspoken yet undeniable. How did America reach this extraordinary collision, and what would happen when the storm truly hit? This wasn't just a heated moment inside a congressional chamber. It was the manifestation of a much larger storm that had been building across the nation for years. On one side sat Melania Trump, a figure who had perfected the art of silence, projecting elegance while sidestepping controversy. On the other stood a Congresswoman who embodied the rising generation of leaders, unafraid, unapologetic, and unwilling to let power glide by unchecked. To understand why the stakes were so high, you had to look beyond that single exchange. America had been simmering with questions about who gets to speak, who gets to belong, and who gets to define what patriotism looks like. For decades, women who dared to speak with fire had been labeled angry, while those who smiled quietly beside powerful men were praised as graceful. This face-off threatened to flip that old narrative on its head. For the immigrant families watching, the moment cut especially deep. Melania herself had come to America as an immigrant, a fact often highlighted to humanize her. Yet the Congresswoman's words reminded the country of an uncomfortable truth. Not all immigrant stories are treated equally. Melania's journey had been gilded by marriage into power, while countless others had fought tooth and nail just to carve out a place in a country that often told them they didn't belong. That was why this clash mattered. It wasn't simply about personality or politics. It was about identity. Who speaks for the immigrant experience? Who embodies dignity? Who defines resilience? Melania, with her rehearsed poise and detached smile, represented one version of America, polished, privileged, image-driven. The Congresswoman, with her raw fire and unvarnished truth, represented another, grounded, unfiltered, rising from the very communities history had tried to silence. And in that chamber, the tension became more than personal. It was generational. It was cultural. It was America deciding whether it still belonged to dynasties and polished masks, or whether it was ready to be reshaped by voices that had long been dismissed. Every sentence from the Congresswoman reverberated beyond the walls. Every flicker of Melania's restrained expression felt symbolic. Millions watching could sense that this was more than a sparring match. It was a referendum on what stories deserved to be told. The journalists knew it too. They scribbled furiously, not just capturing quotes, but trying to bottle the electricity of a moment that was bigger than politics. One reporter whispered to another, "This isn't going away by tomorrow." They were right, because what happened next would not only dominate headlines, it would redefine how the nation remembered both women. The confrontation had only begun, but already the battle lines were clear, and the deeper America dug into Melania's carefully crafted image, the more fragile it would appear against the Congresswoman's unrelenting fire. But the true shock was still ahead. And when the mask finally slipped, the world would never see Melania the same way again. Before the clash ever reached the chamber, Melania Trump had already built a fortress around herself, not of stone, but of image. To millions, she was the silent, impeccably dressed First Lady who floated above the chaos of her husband's presidency like a distant figure in a portrait. Her world was curated, precise, untouchable. Yet beneath the glamour, questions lingered. Who was Melania when the cameras stopped flashing, and how long could the silence hold? Her story began far from Washington. Born in Slovenia, she arrived in the United States with the dream so many immigrants carried. But unlike others, her journey would intersect with wealth and power in ways that rewrote her trajectory. Modeling opened doors, marriage to Donald Trump flung them wide open, and soon she was elevated into a rarefied world of golden elevators, private jets, and front-row access to America's most exclusive circles. For years, her role was clear: the elegant partner, the quiet figure at the edge of the spotlight. And when Donald Trump stormed into politics, Melania's image became more carefully controlled than ever. She was framed as a symbol of grace, a softer contrast to her husband's firebrand rhetoric. The press often described her as mysterious, reserved, even reluctant. And for a while, that worked in her favor. The less she said, the less there was to critique. But silence carries its own weight. When children were torn from their parents at the border, her "I really don't care, do you" jacket became an emblem of tone-deaf privilege. When America demanded empathy, she offered photo ops. When voices rose in protest, she delivered carefully staged campaigns like "Be Best," which felt hollow against the backdrop of her husband's divisive politics. The contradictions piled up. She spoke of anti-bullying while standing beside one of the most publicly aggressive presidents in modern history. She spoke of dignity while living in opulence far removed from the struggles of everyday families. To her supporters, she was misunderstood. To her critics, she was complicit. And to those caught in the middle, she was a symbol of the disconnect between polished image and lived reality. Yet, what made her especially vulnerable was the pedestal she had been placed on. For years, Melania had been shielded from direct confrontation. Her words were rare, her appearances scripted, her interactions carefully managed. Few dared to challenge her outright, perhaps out of courtesy, perhaps out of the mystique she cultivated. But mystique only works until it collides with truth. That day in the chamber, it did. The Congresswoman's fury was not aimed at a carefully curated photograph or a rehearsed speech. It was aimed at Melania herself, the person, the choices, the silence that had stretched for too long. Suddenly, the armor of elegance looked less like strength and more like fragility. For the first time, the cracks were visible. And those cracks mattered because Melania represented more than herself. To her critics, she symbolized the privilege of a life untouched by the grit and grind most Americans knew. To her defenders, she was proof of the American dream, an immigrant who had risen to the highest symbolic role in the land. But in that chamber, the question became unavoidable. Whose immigrant story gets celebrated and whose gets ignored? Her background, once her shield, was now a double-edged sword. The same journey that was used to humanize her also exposed the gulf between her experience and those of millions who had come without privilege, who had built lives through struggle rather than luxury. Melania's silence, once seen as dignity, began to feel like complicity. Her elegance, once admired, began to feel like detachment. And her role as First Lady once cushioned by distance, now placed her directly in the line of fire. She had faced cameras, crowds, and global attention, but she had never faced someone like the Congresswoman. Someone who knew struggle intimately. Someone who could cut through polished veneer with unflinching truth. And as the Congresswoman's words echoed across the chamber, Melania's carefully crafted image was no longer just fragile. It was teetering on the edge of collapse. Because, for the first time, the story wasn't being told by Melania's designers, handlers, or photographers. It was being written by an adversary who refused to play by the rules of politeness. And what came next would test not only Melania's composure, but the very foundation of the myth she had built around herself. Long before her voice thundered across the chamber, the Congresswoman had lived a life that prepared her for that exact moment. Her story did not begin in marble halls or golden towers. It began in neighborhoods where opportunity was scarce, where survival required more grit than glamour. She grew up in a house where the walls were thin and the bills stacked high, where every paycheck stretched to cover the basics, and where dreams had to be fought for, not handed down. Her parents, immigrants who carried both hope and exhaustion on their shoulders, taught her early that nothing would come easy. They worked long hours in jobs that rarely offered dignity, but always demanded sacrifice. The Congresswoman remembered watching her mother come home late at night, feet aching, hands calloused, but still finding the strength to ask her children about their day. That quiet resilience etched itself into her soul. It was proof that true strength wasn't about money or privilege. It was about endurance, about love that carried families forward against impossible odds. From a young age, she learned the sting of being underestimated. Teachers who overlooked her, classmates who mocked her accent, neighbors who whispered that her family didn't belong. Each insult became fuel, each dismissal a reminder that the system was rigged for some and stacked against others. Instead of breaking her, it hardened her resolve. When she entered politics, it wasn't out of ambition for power, it was necessity. She had seen too many families like hers ignored by leaders who claimed to represent them but never truly listened. She became the kind of advocate she wished her parents had when they were working 2, sometimes 3 jobs to keep food on the table. Her campaigns were never polished with billionaire donors or glossy ads. They were grassroots, fueled by volunteers who believed in her fire. And that fire made her dangerous to the political elite, because she didn't come to Washington to play by their rules. She came to rewrite them. In every committee room, in every hearing, she carried the stories of families who had been silenced, and she wielded those stories like a weapon against privilege. That's why her clash with Melania Trump was so much more than personal. It was symbolic. On one side stood a woman who had built her public persona on silence, elegance, and distance. On the other side stood a Congresswoman who had built her career on speaking loudly, unapologetically, refusing to be invisible. Their collision was inevitable. The quiet veneer of privilege versus the uncompromising roar of lived struggle. And it wasn't just her personal history that made her words land with such force. It was her very presence. Every time she stood in that chamber, she carried the weight of communities who had been told to be patient, to wait their turn, to be grateful for scraps. Her speeches weren't just political rhetoric. They were survival stories given a microphone. She often recalled one of her earliest memories, standing in line with her mother at a government office, waiting for hours just to prove they had the right to be here. The humiliation of that day never left her. It taught her that belonging in America was never guaranteed, and that dignity was something you had to demand. That memory returned to her in moments like this, fueling her determination not to let anyone, not even a first lady, rewrite what it meant to be American. In the chamber, when she locked eyes with Melania, it wasn't intimidation she felt. It was recognition. Recognition of the divide between 2 immigrant stories, one cushioned by privilege, the other sharpened by hardship. And it was that recognition that made her speak with such force. She wasn't just speaking for herself. She was speaking for every immigrant child who had ever been told they weren't good enough, for every working-class parent who had sacrificed everything only to be told it wasn't enough. Her story had prepared her for this confrontation in ways Melania could never anticipate. Because while Melania had been shielded by walls of wealth and handlers who crafted her image, the Congresswoman had grown used to fighting bare-knuckled in rooms where no one expected her to win. She thrived in the uncomfortable, in the heated, in the moments when others cracked. That was her arena. And now, standing across from Melania Trump, she knew this was the moment her fire was meant for. Every late-night shift her parents had endured, every insult she had swallowed, every time she had been told to wait her turn, it all surged inside her as fuel. She wasn't here to wait anymore. She was here to fight. And when she finally unleashed the words that had been building in her chest, the chamber would learn that privilege might wear expensive clothes, but truth wears scars. And scars, unlike silk, never break. The clash was inevitable. The question was, who would withstand the storm when the first real blow landed? The chamber had settled into a rhythm, but it was a rhythm built on tension, not civility. Every word the Congresswoman spoke was measured, yet incendiary, each phrase landing like a hammer on the carefully constructed veneer Melania had built over the years. She didn't shout. She didn't need to. Her anger carried weight in its precision, each sentence a scalpel slicing through the distance Melania relied on. "You speak of programs and campaigns," the Congresswoman said, her gaze steady, unwavering. "But what do they mean to those who are struggling right outside these doors? Do they see your speeches as guidance or as reminders of a life they'll never have access to?" A hush fell over the room. Reporters leaned forward, sensing a crescendo of a confrontation that was both symbolic and personal. Cameras zoomed in, capturing Melania's perfectly poised hands resting on the table. Her lips curled into a faint smile, as though that gesture could protect her from the heat of truth bearing down. But the audience, the nation watching through screens, could see through it. The armor was still there, but it wavered under the Congresswoman's relentless intensity. Melania opened her mouth, delivering her rehearsed lines with careful cadence, words meant to calm, to soothe, to distract. "I have always tried to promote kindness and dignity," she said, her tone measured, polished, almost rehearsed. "It is important to lead by example and to advocate for causes that support children and families." But the Congresswoman's fire did not flicker. Instead, it intensified. She leaned slightly closer, her voice a quiet storm that filled the chamber. Kindness and dignity aren't found in gestures meant for photo ops. They're found in action, in listening, in recognizing the pain you cannot erase with a speech. Words are hollow when the people you claim to serve feel invisible. Each exchange drew gasps, a low hum of excitement running through the reporters and staffers present. The room seemed to constrict, as if every eye were focused on the slow unraveling of a narrative carefully curated for years. The Congresswoman's words had weight. They carried the histories of people Melania had never had to understand. Yet here, they pressed against her, demanding acknowledgement. Melania paused briefly, a calculated breath meant to reclaim control. She repeated her talking points, but the rhythm had changed. The room's attention had shifted from polished image to raw reality. She could no longer rely on charm or elegance. Every word was scrutinized for sincerity, for truth, for evidence of understanding that may or may not exist. The Congresswoman noticed the subtle falter and pressed forward. "You can smile, you can nod, you can recite lines crafted by aides, but the truth is that the people you represent or claim to deserve more than optics. They deserve to be seen. And they deserve to know someone in power will fight for them, not just pose for the cameras." It was in that moment the audience sensed the imbalance. The Congresswoman's fire was unstoppable, her composure grounded in lived experience, her words carrying the authority of someone who had earned every syllable. Melania's polish was still there, but it no longer commanded the room. It merely resisted the inevitable storm building across the chamber. Every second of this exchange was a countdown. The Congresswoman's intensity made the air thick, almost electric, leaving reporters and politicians alike holding their breath. They could feel the approaching climax, the moment when restraint would give way to revelation, when truth would collide with privilege in the most undeniable way. And as the final words of this escalation hung between them, the question was clear. Who would emerge not just unscathed, but victorious in the eyes of the nation? Because the next move would not simply be another rebuttal, it would be a declaration. A counterattack designed to shatter pretense, demand attention, and make history. And everyone in that room knew it. The room held its breath. Every eye, every camera lens, every journalist's pen seemed to slow as the Congresswoman leaned forward, resting her forearms lightly on the polished wood of the chamber desk. There was no theatrics, no raising of the voice. This was a storm delivered in measured certainty, in a cadence that left no room for distraction or misinterpretation. "Let's be honest," she began, her voice steady, resonant, carrying the weight of countless unheard voices. "We've been told for years that image matters more than reality, that elegance can mask indifference, that a smile can substitute for action. But here, in this chamber, and in this country, appearances are not enough. People's lives are." Melania's fingers twitched lightly against her clasped hands. She had faced press conferences, interviews, and global scrutiny before, but this was different. There was no handler, no script, no team of aides crafting the words for her. The Congresswoman spoke with authority born of struggle, of experience, of every hardship that had forged her. And the polish and composure Melania relied upon could not shield her from the truth being delivered so plainly. The Congresswoman paused, allowing the room to absorb the weight of her statement. Silence stretched taut, almost painfully. It was the kind of silence that demands reflection, that presses against your chest until the words sink in. Cameras clicked, and even the most seasoned reporters leaned forward, sensing the shift in the air, a tectonic movement in what had seemed like a routine confrontation. "You've lived a life insulated from the struggles of the people you claim to serve," she continued, her tone now sharpening, but still controlled. "You speak of programs and initiatives, but while you are celebrated for appearances, real children go hungry, real families go unheard, real immigrants risk everything for a chance to be seen, and too often the doors are closed to them, doors you and your world pass through without question." And still, the Congresswoman held her final stance, not gloating, not triumphant in arrogance, but in quiet authority. She allowed a brief pause, letting her words sink fully into the room and into history. Then she concluded, soft but absolute. "Privilege may shield you for a time, but it cannot shield you from the reckoning of truth. And today, the reckoning has arrived." The room exhaled collectively, though no one dared move too quickly. Reporters scribbled, cameras rolled, and colleagues exchanged glances that spoke louder than words. Every person present understood that this moment would be remembered, dissected, and shared. It was a lesson in courage, preparation, and the power of voice wielded responsibly. Melania's composure, once nearly impenetrable, had been tested against fire forged in hardship, and the cracks were undeniable. The Congresswoman had done more than speak. She had claimed the moral high ground, anchored in lived experience, and the chamber had felt the force of it. Outside, the world would not take long to react. Social media, news outlets, and ordinary citizens absorbed the moment with collective awe. Memes, hashtags, and clips began circulating almost instantly, amplifying the confrontation far beyond the walls of the chamber. But inside, for those present, the lesson was immediate, visceral, and unignorable. Truth could not be polished away. And as the Congresswoman sat back, allowing the weight of her words to linger, a silent understanding passed through the room. History had been made, not with theatrics, not with wealth or design, but with courage, clarity, and unyielding commitment to the people she served. The next chapter, the aftermath, was already unfolding beyond the chamber walls, and when the world saw it, the shock waves would reach far further than anyone could predict. Melania shifted, ever so slightly, a subtle flicker of tension in her posture. For the first time, her smile seemed carefully weighed rather than effortless. The Congresswoman noticed. She always notices. Years of navigating hardship had taught her to read every pause, every inhale, every micro-expression. The next words were delivered with surgical precision. Dignity is not a campaign slogan. Kindness is not a staged photo. Leadership is not a title. It is accountability. And today, accountability is being demanded of you. not because we want confrontation, but because the people deserve honesty, and silence is no longer sufficient. The chamber remained still, the tension palpable. Even the aides hovering at the edges of the room looked on with widened eyes. What they were witnessing was not simply a verbal exchange, it was the dismantling of a narrative. Every rehearsed phrase Melania had relied on, every carefully sculpted posture, every image of serene elegance, they were all faltering under the Congresswoman's relentless clarity. Then came the line that would be repeated across the nation, the one that crystallized the moment for social media, news outlets, and late-night conversations alike. You may have a platform, but we have the people. You may have polish, but we have truth. And truth, unlike elegance, cannot be fabricated. A collective murmur ran through the chamber, part shock, part awe. Melania's eyes met the Congresswoman's, and for a moment, the room seemed suspended. The illusion of untouchable composure had cracked. Every calculated gesture now carried the weight of vulnerability. The Congresswoman, calm yet ferocious, held the space with a certainty that could not be denied. The applause was not immediate. It didn't need to be. Recognition of the moment's gravity hung in the air like an electric charge. The media cameras captured every subtle gesture, a slight tremor in Melania's hand, the steady resolve in the Congresswoman's gaze. Social media, streaming live, began to erupt in real time. Clips of the exchange were already trending within minutes, captions highlighting the courage, the confrontation, the moment when image collided with truth. The moment left the chamber in stunned silence, but the world outside was anything but quiet. Screens lit up across the nation. News anchors replayed the exchange, captions flashing bold statements. Congresswoman calls out First Lady. Privilege meets truth. Historic showdown in Washington. Within minutes, the confrontation became more than a story. It became a phenomenon. On social media, hashtags surged. Hashtag truth over privilege trended alongside hashtag mic drop moment, and clips of the Congresswoman's piercing words were shared, reshared, and dissected in every corner of the digital landscape. Comment threads overflowed with admiration, outrage, and validation. Immigrant communities saw themselves reflected in her fire. Working-class families felt their struggles recognized, and progressive audiences celebrated the courage it took to confront entrenched power so directly. Memes emerged, some humorous, some reverent, all amplifying the core message. Image could be polished, but truth could not be silenced. Late-night hosts replayed the highlights, dissecting body language, timing, and tone. Pundits debated endlessly, but the consensus was unmistakable. The Congresswoman had delivered a moment that transcended ordinary politics. It was cinematic, electrifying, unforgettable. Even politicians who typically stayed neutral on appearances were forced to weigh in. Tweets from high-profile lawmakers, both allies and opponents, acknowledged the power of her words. Courage in the chamber, one wrote. She reminded America what leadership looks like, said another. The reverberations were instant and undeniable. Meanwhile, Melania Trump's image, long curated with meticulous care, began to crack under public scrutiny. Analysts dissected her composure, her rehearsed responses, and her subtle reactions. The contrast was stark. Polished elegance versus unfiltered truth, image versus lived experience. Critics seized the narrative, arguing that silence and aesthetics could not withstand accountability when confronted with moral clarity and authentic voice. In communities across the country, people reacted not only to the confrontation itself, but to the validation it represented. Immigrants shared stories of hardship, parents recounted struggles that went unseen, and young women wrote about the inspiration of witnessing someone demand recognition for the overlooked and unheard. The Congresswoman's courage became a mirror for millions, a reminder that their stories mattered and that silence was not mandatory. Commentators and social media personalities dissected every moment of the exchange, from pauses to gestures to emphasis, turning the event into a cultural touchstone. Clips circulated on TikTok, Instagram Reels went viral, and YouTube compilations began cropping up within hours. It was no longer just a congressional exchange, it was a movement, a symbol of accountability meeting privilege head-on. Yet, beneath the virality, the deeper impact took hold. Citizens debated, families discussed, classrooms examined the confrontation as a case study in courage and rhetorical skill. People questioned the narratives they had been taught about who deserved attention, who deserved voice, and who could wield power responsibly. The chamber's clash had become a lens through which the nation reconsidered fairness, privilege, and dignity. For Melania, the aftermath was less celebratory. Her carefully constructed persona, meant to convey elegance and restraint, now seemed fragile. Every replay, every viral clip highlighted the contrast between polished performance and lived reality. And the public began to see that behind the silence, there was a vulnerability previously unseen. Her image, once untouchable, was now subject to scrutiny, debate, and critique. For the Congresswoman, the aftermath brought not arrogance, but vindication and responsibility. The words she had spoken echoed across the country, reverberating in communities that had long been overlooked. She had not merely won a debate, she had elevated the conversation about representation, justice, and truth. The shockwaves were far from over. The confrontation had ignited discussions, inspired advocacy, and challenged narratives. And while the world processed what had happened in real time, one undeniable truth persisted. Courage, preparation, and authenticity had collided with privilege, and the results would be felt for months, even years to come. Yet even as the nation buzzed with commentary and analysis, the deeper lesson was waiting, one that transcended politics, headlines, and viral clips, a lesson about dignity, integrity, and the power of one voice to pierce through even the most polished facades. And as the digital storm raged on, one question lingered in the hearts of those watching. What would the Congresswoman do next? And how would the story of this confrontation shape the future of power, privilege, and truth in America? In the wake of the confrontation, the chamber had emptied, but the impact lingered like an echo that refused to fade. The Congresswoman remained seated for a moment, letting the gravity of the moment settle. She did not speak for applause or recognition. She spoke because someone had to, because silence was no longer an option. And in that stillness, the lesson crystallized. This clash was never merely about personalities. It was about principles, about values that had guided her every step and would guide the nation if people chose to see them. She thought of the communities she represented, of immigrant families who had sacrificed everything for a chance at dignity, of children who worked harder than anyone should have to just to survive, of parents whose courage often went unnoticed. Her voice had carried their stories into a space that had long ignored them. And that was the true victory, not the momentary falter of a polished facade, but the affirmation that truth and integrity could not be silenced. Privilege may grant comfort, but it cannot grant understanding. Wealth may buy appearances, but it cannot buy empathy. Power may amplify a message, but it cannot replace moral authority. These truths were not abstract concepts, they were lived realities, and in the chamber that day, the Congresswoman had wielded them like a sword, not to wound, but to illuminate. Across the nation, viewers internalized the lesson differently, but the effect was universal. Immigrant families saw themselves reflected in her fire and resilience. Young women recognized the audacity to confront entrenched power. Communities long told to stay quiet felt seen. For millions, the confrontation became a beacon. Courage, preparation, and authenticity could pierce even the most impenetrable image. And yet, the Congresswoman's takeaway extended beyond the spectacle. She understood that confrontation alone was not the goal. The goal was transformation, a reminder that leadership demands accountability, that dignity is earned through action, and that truth is a force more powerful than any carefully constructed image. The applause, the trending hashtags, the viral clips, these were only symptoms of a deeper reality. When you speak with integrity and purpose, you shift the very conversation, and sometimes the culture itself. The resonance of that moment offered more than political commentary. It offered inspiration. It reminded ordinary people that their experiences mattered, that their voices could challenge systems, and that courage often arrives in the form of persistence, preparation, and moral clarity. It reminded them that adversity, when met with resilience, can become a catalyst for change. For the Congresswoman, the chamber was no longer just a room. It was a stage upon which the values of justice, dignity, and courage were dramatized for all to witness. And as she reflected, she realized that this confrontation, intense and scrutinized as it had been, was a small part of a larger struggle. a struggle to ensure that all voices, especially the marginalized and overlooked, would have a place in the story of America. The nation had watched a symbolic duel of privilege versus perseverance, of polish versus authenticity, and the outcome was clear. Truth, once unleashed, is unstoppable, and the lesson lingered beyond headlines and social media feeds. It was the understanding that courage is contagious, that one voice can ignite a movement, and that integrity is never out of fashion. And as the echoes of that confrontation continued to ripple across the country, the final thought remained. History may remember the elegance, the wealth, the image, but it will revere the courage, the fire, and the truth. And in that reverence lies the inspiration for generations to come. Because in the end, dignity triumphs over pretense, preparation triumphs over performance, and the voices that refuse to be silenced are the ones that change the world. And yet, even as the chamber emptied and the nation digested what had transpired, one question lingered. How would the world respond next? And who else would rise to carry the torch of truth forward? This was the first face-off, a confrontation that went beyond politics and spectacle. How Melania Trump first faced off against a furious Congresswoman wasn't just a headline. It was a lesson in courage, truth, and accountability. A reminder that privilege can be challenged, that image alone cannot withstand authenticity, and that one determined voice can make the nation pause and reflect. Millions witnessed a historic collision of worlds, the polished elegance of a first lady meeting the raw, unfiltered fire of someone who had earned every word through struggle and perseverance. The Congresswoman didn't just speak. She represented countless unheard voices. She embodied resilience, and she reminded America that dignity and integrity are more powerful than any carefully curated image. And now, the story is yours to carry forward. Share it with those who need to hear that their voices matter. Subscribe to witness the moments when courage challenges complacency, when truth confronts pretense, and when ordinary people step into extraordinary roles to demand justice. Join the movement that celebrates the power of resilience, the importance of accountability, and the unstoppable force of authentic leadership. Because history doesn't remember silence. It remembers those who speak, who act, who refuse to be sidelined. And every time you share the story, you become part of that narrative, part of the wave that refuses to let injustice go unnoticed. So take this moment, reflect on its lesson, and ask yourself, how will you rise to speak your truth, challenge privilege, and stand for dignity? The nation is watching, and every voice counts. The first face-off may have ended, but the story and the movement is only beginning.